Actually, I'm officially not here, but turned out I should. This panel is on new findings. Can people hear us? Or are we going to need to use the microphone?
Can you all hear me out there?
No. Okay. The title of this panel is New Findings in History and Archaeology. How do these inform fiction? I'm not going to read the whole blurb because it's long, but the basic premise is that fiction authors are seekers of truth who are always scouring monographs and other books in the hopes that there will be some new discovery that they can apply to their fiction. We will spend an hour just amusing you with that notion. However, let's do the traditional introduction, so we can start on that end.
Okay, good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me as well. My name is Rosemary Claire Smith, and I began life as an archaeologist, primarily in prehistoric North American archaeology, the American Southwest, New England, and sporadic areas in between, before I switched over to some other professions and eventually landed as a writer. I use a lot of what I've learned about prehistory in terms of my writing, and especially writing a lot about non-traditional societies. It's great background for that. If you've heard of me at all, it may be because I have a series of stories about dinosaurs that are in analog that have come out in the last few years. And I'll stop there.
I'm Rhiannon Helt. I am currently, in my day job, an archaeologist. Kind of the unsexy kind. I work for a private firm that does compliance archaeology. So before construction, we check to make sure that there's something there. My first series is an urban fantasy series, 4 books. The Silver series, it's got werewolves, you probably guessed. My newest book is a standalone called Hound and Key, in the dealer's room at Larry Smith. And that one has the archaeology sort of more subtly in terms of world building, because it's based on tales and oral traditions and all that sort of stuff from around the world.
My name is Eric Flint. I have written a lot of novels that involve history one way or the other. Early in my life, I was actually planning to be an archaeologist, and I took several courses in it until I realized how hard the work was. At which point I decided to become an historian, where the work is much less hard. And I trained to be that. I have advanced degrees in history. I wound up never actually doing it professionally until many years later I started writing historical fiction.
I'm Dave Drake. My first novel was an Arthurian fantasy from 1979. The book I just turned in, as it turns out, to Bain, is based on the matter of Britain, also in a wholly different fashion. So you could say that I started, and although I don't plan to die here, but I have made an arc of Arthurian fiction with 60 or 70 books in between.
Yeah, I'm S.M. Sterling, Steve Sterling. I write science fiction and fantasy. I started out to be a historian because I imagined myself, like giving seminars in a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches. And then I learned and a pipe. And then I learned what people who tried to make a career of history actually did, which was live on dog food and do the professor's work. So I switched to law, which was totally useless, and then became a writer. But history and archaeology remain among my preoccupations and my hobbies. I read all the magazines. I do actually read monographs on lithic sequences and stuff. And it's all incredibly useful, but you write fiction, not monographs.
All right. Trying to figure out where to start with this. There's a reason archaeology is considered very dry. I think what we should start with is, to what extent, does anybody here, to what extent has anyone ever chosen a story, to write a story based on discovering something, some historical fact or archaeological fact that you did not know prior to that, and that inspired you to face a story. Did that ever happen?
Yes, absolutely. I was reading Pliny's Natural History, and I was looking up squid for various reasons in Pliny's Natural History, and he mentions that in the ships that Alexander sent back from India to ultimately Babylon, that in the course of their trundling across the North Indian Ocean, that they had run into large squid. And I thought, ooh, this is kind of a neat thing. I can turn this into fiction, which I did, deliberately, not learning any more about it than that. God, it was a totally different, I assumed it was some sort of a scouting expedition. No, it was supposed to be the supply fleet, but because they didn't know about the monsoons, they couldn't actually put into shore, and that's why you have Alexander ultimately marching north through the Gedrosian desert, which was a horrible path, but it was better than on the seacoast, where there was no food. And he had intended to be supplied by the supply fleet, which couldn't put into shore because of the contrary winds. But I made this a small scouting force, and I got a story out of it, which was, in fact, my second sold story. So yes, I have done that, and the reason that it worked was totally almost totally.
Steve?
Well, it probably occurred, but since I read history constantly,
Yeah.
I don't know where the ideas just specifically bubble up from. I've had some ideas for stories recently on prompted by paleo DNA stuff, but I haven't actually gotten around to writing them because I'm committed to stuff. So many books, so little time.
A little bit related to that, not archaeology per se, but paleontology. I was reading about an interesting dinosaur called the Kentrosaurus, which is your basic dinosaur that's been designed by committee, where half the committee thought, oh, stegosaurus plates, we need a lot of them, and the other half of the committee thought spikes, we need those. So in all good committee fashion, this dinosaur has both the stegosaurus-like plates and the spikes, and I started thinking, well, when you have a line of spikes going down your spine and your tail and around your hip bones and all of that, how exactly do two of these creatures produce little baby kentrosauruses? It sounds like it's
Carefully, very
not
carefully.
the easiest thing in the world. So my story that's called Dinomate, that is in this April analog, was based on that and my speculations about it.
I often get captured when I visit locations. For the past decade or so, I've been sort of trying to do the grand archaeological tour of North America. And so I'm trying to go to sites of real sort of cultural importance that maybe people would know about, like Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest. Not a lot of people have heard of it, but at the time, culturally, it seems like it was quite important. And then often, I'm like, well, I'm in the area, I'll go to some other place. And then that's often because as an archaeologist, I'm often trying to find people's daily lives rather than the life of the king or the chief or whatever. And so it happened this summer. I haven't written it yet, but I definitely want to. I went to Lanza Meadows, which is the Norse site in Newfoundland. And that was cool and great, and I loved it. And while I was there, I went to an iron mine off the coast of Newfoundland, in Bell Island. And it's so cool because it was mined with the Roman pillar method. So you go down, there's all these tunnels, and they're around, sort of it's a reverse honeycomb, where they leave these pillars to hold up the ceiling. And I want to set a story there. I don't know quite what story it's going to be yet, but just being underground, and you go under and you follow the dip of the layer of ore, and you go beneath the sea, but it's way, way above you, so it's not like you're getting dripped on or anything like that. You go miles underground, or you used to be able to. We only
What
went
period
over there.
was the mining?
So that was the end of the 19th century, so
Okay.
it wasn't super old, but they were at the beginning still working by candlelight, and they were using horses to drag the ore carts up to the surface.
Roman methods in more senses than one.
Yes.
I don't know that I've ever written a story, started off with the idea to write a story based on discovering some historical or archaeological fact. I can't think of any. But what does happen frequently is that once I've decided to write a story, and you always wind up doing a ton of research, then all sorts of things will be discovered that will then often shape which way I decide to go with the story or how I decide to tell it. That's much more commonly what happens with me. And then I need to explain the dark side of this, which is that you have to understand a historical fiction writer has to do research in a few months that a scholar would spend a career doing. And so, and without making too many mistakes. So one of the things you learn is how to cover your ass. And one of the best ways to do that is to, I have been fascinated by locations just like she described, of, oh wow, this would be a great place to set a story. Occasionally I've done it, but one of the things I always keep an eye out when I'm doing research is I always note this, is okay, this particular structure was later torn down. So I can set the story there because nobody can prove me wrong.
Let me give an example of that, which he's a really good, I have been known, I write plot outlines for other people to expand into the novels. Sometimes, and both of these guys have expanded my novels, or my plot outlines. Well, there have been, and both of these have done extremely well and are themselves New York Times bestselling authors now. However, there have been other people. And one of my outlines had been expanded by someone who would not do utterly basic research. And, I used an easily accessible Icelandic thing, a parliament sort of milieu. Couldn't bother to research that at all. And wound up with a novel that I told Jim I wanted to take my name off it, and he blew up. No, I actually, when I saw what the guy had written, I told Jim, I really don't want my name on this, and he got furious with me. So my name went on it, but I have it written in all future contracts, and that includes the contracts for these two guys, that I will read the book after it is turned in, and if I am happy with the book, my name will go on it, and I will get paid additional money, and if I'm not, they can go off and do any goddamn thing they want, but I will not be associated with it. So, and there's never been another problem, but there was a real problem. So, in setting one of the Belisarius novels in an Indian setting, I created a Hindu heresy that all the bad guys are involved with. Okay, see, I had no idea who would be expanding it. As it turned out, Jim hires found the perfect person to do these. He's a commie. And he'll do it great. So the plot outline goes to Eric. And finally, after a month,
Oh, long time.
yeah, he had been trying to research this cult. And he knew it was real because he could find the name of the god that was set around. But he couldn't find any of the cult activity. So he finally came to me, and I burst out laughing. I had looked up a group of Hindu gods, and I found there was a demigod of the planet Mars. And so that's what the bad guys, their cult is focused on the demigod of the planet Mars. So yes, this is really a Hindu deity of sorts. And there is no cult, that's whatever. So whatever this complete incompetent, as the previous guy had been, does with it, I'm not going to be embarrassed. So it caused huge problem, but he actually, researched stuff the way I research stuff, and he was trying to do it where it didn't exist.
I will admit that sometimes I try to, as an archaeologist reading other people's work, I try to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, specifically for when they have something come out of context. So you should do basic research about whatever people, and you can look up that people and whatever, get those details right. But I'll give you an example. There was something I read where they had big, huge, like tall as a person, obsidian statues of animals. And to somebody, I know obsidian because of stone tools, that makes no sense because it's basically glass.
Yeah.
And so it shatters, and you could possibly do something like cut glass with it, but you can't shape it like you could another stone. But that's something where you wouldn't necessarily know to look that up. And I think that the stuff we're talking about in the panel with this sort of new bleeding edge of archaeological thought, if people go with the old thought, I sometimes will give them the benefit of the doubt, because often as archaeologists, we're still hashing it out. I wrote down pre-Clovis is something that's a newer interpretation. And so we know probably the old sort of thing, people came over through Alaska and then down through the Midwest and in quote unquote ice-free corridor. That's probably bogus. That's probably not how it happened. But people are still arguing about how it did happen.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of support behind the idea that they came down the coast, sort of hopping island to island along Alaska and then BC.
But South America may have gotten some folks floated over with their chickens. Remember, you have chickens showing up all over South America a lot quicker than they could have spread if they'd come down the way they traditionally did.
Yeah, and since it's still sort of in progress, I'm much more likely to sort of grant somebody, an older way of thinking, or if they write it right now and they have them coming down the coast and then we find out there's actually no support for that, it being a product of their time, it's like, oh, well, they did the best with what we thought at
And
the time.
there are fashions in historical and archaeological thought. For a long time, people studying the Maya were projecting this peaceful, numerically obsessed thing on them, and then they learned to interpret their script.
That isn't entirely. The archaeologists they had been interpreting the script very early on. They were lying to general readers about what they were saying. You have descriptions that were known from the very beginning of the person being skinned alive over a matter of a week and his agony as this was going on. And the whole myth of the gentle Maya was conscious disinformation put out by people who wanted that belief.
Yeah, that's the less charitable interpretation. But it's probably accurate. Yeah.
Well, it was either that or they were totally ignorant of what, they were unable to read what they were actually translating in their own diaries.
Yeah, or to take another example, in European archaeology, over the past 60 or 70 years, there's been a pronounced bias against earlier interpretations of culture change through migration. Then recently, we've gotten a lot better at recovering prehistoric DNA and historic DNA. And I found out there were a lot more migrations than this interpretation thought. The most conspicuous example would be the origins of the corded ware battle axe cultures in Europe, which they've recently shown to be the result of an almost complete population replacement by migration from what's now the Ukraine and Kazakhstan. This was actually the earlier interpretation that was replaced by the counter-migrationist interpretation, and has now been replaced again. So these things, change and then change and then change again. You never have access to the past. You only have access to interpretations and beliefs about the past, which are based on evidence, and the evidence does change.
And now that they're getting into mitochondrial DNA,
Yeah.
they're learning some stuff that, no, this is quite different. But the core of this panel, I think the reason that they put this panel on was the current reinterpretation of the German migration, the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain. And the current bet is that the Saxon shore was called the Saxon shore not because the forts were there to defend against the Saxon raiders, but that they were in fact manned by Saxon mercenaries. And that when everything, when the central government moved out, it's pretty obvious now that Britain wasn't ever very well Romanized. You have no trace of a Latin language in British culture, whereas in Romania, Dacia, as was, you still have a Romance language.
Well, I mean, English becomes highly Latinized, but that's because of the Norman.
Yeah, that's coming,
Right.
that's back.
But early English, Old English, is a Germanic language. It's a specific type of Germanic language. It's a Northwest Germanic language, closely related to what later on became Netherlandish, Frisian, and Northwestern German dialects, and also what was originally spoken in Jutland. So it's the result of transferring a language from a specific part of the Germanic sphere to England. When the Romans said Saxon in late Roman times, they essentially meant German in a boat.
Yeah.
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 And
Yeah.
there were Saxon raiders as far south as Spain. They also tended to recruit the same people to fight them. So the forts of the Saxon shore were both defending against Saxons and manned by Saxons. So I think that's probably the explanation for that. The Romanized parts of Britannia were the parts that became English. The south and the southeast were the areas where there had been most intensive Romanization. So they were wiped out. What was left was the wilds of Wales. Now, Welsh actually has a stratum of Roman-era loanwords from Latin. Not a very large one, but it's there. And there's some evidence that Latin continued to be used in the Britannic ruled areas of former Britannia for several centuries after the Roman withdrawal, but mostly as a learned language. The interesting thing about Old English is that it has almost no Brittonic loanwords, about 20 all up. Whereas, for example, French, the language that became French, the Romance language that became French, has 700 or 800 Germanic loans and about 200 or 300 Celtic ones. Old English is almost exclusively Germanic. And if you look at the place names in England, they show an extreme lack of bilingualism. There's dozens of rivers in England named Avon. Avon is the Proto-Welsh word for a river. So it's river. And there are lots of geographical features where you find exactly the same thing. It's
Very much like English cuisine, okay.
Yeah. It's obviously someone grabbing someone by the throat and saying, "What's that?" And he says, "The hill." And he says, "Ah, hill."
If I may, about when we're talking about Roman England and all of that, I think sometimes there's a tendency to think, okay, the Roman legions and whatnot that came to England would have been composed of soldiers who came from the Italian peninsula, which is not actually the way that the Roman Empire worked to begin with. What they did in a lot of cases was they might take their group of soldiers would have been from the Middle East or would have been from North Africa or someplace like that and shipped up.
Sarmatians. Yeah.
And if you think about it, it makes wonderful sense if you want to hold together an empire. These are folks who do not blend in easily or at all with the local communities, don't speak the same language, don't look like them, don't have the same culture. And if they're thinking about defecting, it's a much harder thing for them to do.
Well, also, they're not home where
They're
their
not.
kin are raising trouble.
Yes.
I mean, you're really resettling captives frequently.
That's right. And so when you do have the end of the Roman Empire, which is not a boom here today, one day, and not the next, but you end up having a number of peoples who are basically stranded where they are.
But the question was posed as, does this change the way we're going to write an Arthurian fantasy? And I don't see any reason why it should. You know, the classic Matter of Britain romance was completely historically nonsense
From the beginning.
from the beginning.
Yeah.
And it should not make any difference that, look, I tried when I wrote The Dragon Lord in 1978. I was trying to be not historically accurate, but accurate according to what history there was, and trying to make it realistic. It probably wasn't in the least. I was trying.
Yeah. Besides which, if you go back far enough, no one knows or ever will know the details. Like I wrote something set in Bronze Age, what's now southern England, around Stonehenge, set in the 13th century BC. We have some stones, we have some bones, we have some pots. We have no secure knowledge of what even language family was spoken there. We don't even know if they were speaking Indo-European languages at the time. So you can pretty much write on a blank slate if you're going that far back. I mean, you know, you can't put Chinese there, but you know, short of that, you can do pretty much anything you want. You can make culture. Yeah, you yeah. Like, oh, speaking of DNA, recently they found a body buried on what was an imperial estate in 1st century AD Italy, and they got the DNA from the hyoid bone, which is where it's usually preserved. And they found this person was almost certainly either from the Far East themselves or their father had been from the Far East. So somebody from East Asia or their immediate first generation descendant ended up working on an imperial estate in Italy in the 1st century AD. You know, now there's a story.
Yeah.
You know, there's the potential for a story. How did that guy get there? And that's actually a story that would be interesting to write, although I have no time for it.
But that's the point. You've got a lot of options for story settings, and as Eric made quite clear in his opening, we're not here to inform you. We're here to entertain you. And a good job, you'll probably learn something also, but that is not the point of what we're doing.
Yes, we're not here to make you suffer for all this.
I was going to say, I think the one danger I see in going too far backwards, like, oh, well, nobody can say any different, which is a lot of sort of the waters I swim in as a North American archaeologist with sort of pre-contact, archaeology. You do have the information that can be quite good at times you get from oral traditions of the descendants of those people, but is that it's really easy to have that lack of solid evidence let you take your modern assumptions and sort of impress themselves upon it. And I see that so much with North American archaeology, where when the only preservation you have is of stone tools, suddenly you get this sort of impression that stone tools were everything
Yeah.
in this society, and probably that was very, very much not the case. And that also sort of dovetails with a sort of mid-century older idea of archaeology where, well, the men were making the stone tools, and that was obviously an important part of society and anything else. And we're sort of slowly growing out of that, but there's still when the only things you have are the stone, it's easy to sort of impress what you imagine might be important about it.
You don't see all those deer skins that the women had gummed to softness and usability because they rotted,
You know the
along with the women's teeth.
You know the old story about the drunk looking for his keys under the street light?
Yes.
And he's asked, was that where you dropped your keys? And he says, no, but that's where the light is. And it's the same thing with historical evidence. We tend to overvalue the things that survive, and things like stone and bone survive. Sometimes metal survives. Organic remains don't survive, but we are organic, and most of human technology for most of human history was like things like wood and leather.
And basketry.
The basketry.
It's particularly true with historians, the more they're focused on a period where there's very little documentation, there's a kind of inevitable pressure to make any document you find really, really valuable. And David and I ran into this issue when we were doing the Belsara series because for dramatic reasons in this novel, in this series, David did not want to have the relationship between Belisarius and Antonina be an adulterous one on her part, which I agreed with because that tends to introduce an entirely different dynamic in a story, and we wanted something different. Okay. The historical problem we face is that there is a very well-known document called The Secret History by the Procopius, which basically portrays Emperor Justinian and Theodora and Antonina as basically a bunch of demons.
Literally in the case of the emperor. I mean, he literally is in two places at the same time.
Yeah.
And anyway,
didn't like
so
him.
the thing about this is it has been basically taken as good coin by historians forever. And if you read the thing,
It's ridiculous.
It reads like the National Enquirer. I mean,
The only thing it doesn't have is the alien, but it's got demons.
yeah, and so we just decided, screw it. So what we did is we wrote into the novel that Antonina fooled Procopius into thinking she was engaged in all kinds of, and so he then went out and wrote this damn thing.
I mean,
But you run into that a lot. I mean, if you're in a historical period, there are 3 documents, you cannot assume, maybe they're accurate, but, you don't really have much you can check it against.
Think about a scandal sheet now. How much of it is accurate? Think about a really paranoid blog.
But we would get angry letters.
Yeah.
Well, don't you know? And well, for that matter, I got one claiming that I was ripping off Jerry Purnell.
For what?
Oh, for the Nike, the Nikkei insurrection. I ripped off Jerry Purnell in the Mercenary because I based something on the Nika insurrection.
Which actually happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jerry, and it didn't occur to these people that, no, actually, that was a real historical source, and we're both using it. Yeah.
God forbid.
Well, but the people who write those kind of angry letters tend to be kind of stupid. Look, I'm not saying I don't, or we don't, or all of us don't make mistakes. Of course we do. But when you call me a fool for not knowing that, and it was Eric who did this, but the tapers were South American, so nobody could make a joke regarding a taper. And in fact, the largest taper is the Malayan taper, and the chance of it being in a menagerie in a princely house in North India was actually pretty good. And there is even a description in Cassius style of a beast in the arena in the 3rd century AD, which sure looks to me like he was talking about a tapir. So, would I have put that in the book? No, I wouldn't have. But what Eric did, I could make a case for it being there.
Yeah, it's because he got pissed off.
I did.
What actually happened was, it was just a goof on my part. I just wasn't thinking about it. It didn't occur to me.
But I could
Yeah,
justify it.
I know. But here's my reaction when that jackass sent in the letter was, get a life! We're talking about a series that's 850,000 words long, 6 fat novels, and this is a toss-away clause in one sentence.
Well, I think it was in the 4th book.
It was in
so-
the 4th book.
That was where the tapir caper was.
But it was a throwaway line, that's it.
Well, do we want to start taking?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
sure.
Okay. To get slightly back to archaeology,
Sorry.
two things. I had read an instance, where they were digging, paleontologists were digging in a cave in Georgia, that is the Caucasus, Georgia, and got 5 prehistoric Stone Age burials at once. So they were all buried in the same time, which is, you archaeologists know, it's just incredibly rare to get human skeletons, contemporaneous human skeletons. And the interesting thing about it was that if it had been discovered individually, the temptation would have been strong to say, ooh, 5 different varieties of human beings. They had enough, I mean, human beings have enough variation anyway, but they had, so this population had enough variation that if you were a splitter rather than a lumper, then you would have had this up. But apropos splitting and lumping in Chinese and Wales, the DNA work, which is there's highly contentious work being done around the origins of agriculture in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Which has been going on for years, and the latest installment is that they got the DNA samples from 4 different populations around the Fertile Crescents. And the DNA difference between the population in the Zagros Mountains and the population in what is now the Levant is greater than the DNA difference between Europeans and Chinese.
Yeah, well,
So
I see you too have read the
3 or
latest
4
edition of Antiquity.
populations who are all involved in the invention of agriculture, who are genetically distinct.
Yeah, the thing is, this is going to be contentious for quite some time.
Yes, it is.
Because the
But
invention.
your story possibilities right now
Yeah.
are enormous.
John Ringo has really lucked out.
Like, it's like the invention of the wheel. We know that the wheel was invented sometime in the 4th millennium BC, because that's when it first appears. But it spreads so fast and so widely, it's almost impossible to say where did the wheel come from. Did it come from Mesopotamia and spread to Eastern Europe, or did it come from
Basically,
Eastern
everybody
Europe?
who sees the wheel goes, fuck!
Exactly. You know, this is actually, though, where linguistic reconstruction can help. Not determine things, but help a bit. Like, there are two words in Proto-Indo-European for wheel. They're both from roots. One root means the twisty thing, and the other means the turny thing. So it's probably not a loan word, but that's as good as you can get that far back. And agriculture is another thing that spreads so rapidly. It's very difficult to say exactly where it came from.
Well, but nobody looked at a cornfield and went, fuck. They might
Yeah.
have gone, how the fuck did you do that? But not, I did.
Yeah, but they think that the actual domestication of small grains in the Middle East took place very quickly, because they've experimented with the wild grains, and it only takes about 12 generations of the wild grain to get a domestic form. So,
Yeah.
I think that Rhiannon had mentioned obsidian, and I was wondering if the author had explained it in some way, such as using the world of fantasy, like strengthened it with magic or whatever, if that would have made that world a little bit more plausible to you. And how do you take something that we know, say the Egyptians or whatever, and allow for that world to be different?
Well, for the particular example, I would say that would be completely legit in my mind, just because it shows that you've thought about it. And you don't want to
Yeah.
say that magic solves every problem.
But if they'd really thought about it, they would have used diorite.
And I think that where you can sometimes go wrong with saying, well, magic allows them to have this more advanced aspect to their society. Though advanced, I mean, what's advanced? If it does the job, then where you
You
run
gotta
into
be
trouble is if you don't sort of realize that that particular culture had a perfectly good solution of their own, and so you're sort of imposing your assumptions about, okay, so the type of leadership structure or something like that. So you impose a modern or a feudal leadership structure onto ancient Egypt because the magic made it evolve that way, and so that's different, and you're explaining that. But the local people had their own leadership structure that solved the problems they needed it to solve, probably, if it persisted for any length of time. And so I think that sometimes it's sad to see the missed opportunity to take up the cool solution that somebody in the past came up with because it totally solved their problems at that point, and to sort of impose something that we happen to think is better because we're more familiar with it.
Well, hydraulic despotism, I mean, it really does look as though the need for agricultural, spreading the water around and resurveying after every flood, created the form of government. Very top-down, organized, bureaucratic.
The alleged similarities between these forms of government, which is what she's talking about, they've all pretty much evolved from the bottom up, and the differences are as great as the similarities.
The other thing you have to keep in mind is that it isn't what you don't know that will kill you. It's what you think you know that isn't so. And people tend to project on the past the sort of generalized conception of the past. And you run into this both ways. You do it yourself if you're not careful, and when you don't do it, other people object that you're getting it wrong because you actually have the specific information rather than the generalized past which they project onto everything. I could go into real interesting details about how Edo Japan solved the urban sewage problem at this point, but I won't bore you with that.
Yeah, there.
Okay, there's a book called The First Fossil Hunters, and it's by Adrian Mayer, and it talks about how many of our current monsters are actually misinterpretations of real fossils, like dinosaurs are interpreted as dragons, and other things are interpreted as ogres, or cyclops, and so on. I'm wondering if, and it still happens, there's a recent fossil that was upside down for many years, but hallucinated.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Burgess Shale has, hugely been reinterpreted in the last 50 years.
Are there any stories where they were based on an archaeological misinterpretation? Not done out of malice or with an agenda, but simply by mistake?
Ignorance.
Harry
Because we can
Turtledove
tell
did it.
stories over time, we can actually tell the entire story of what the truth is and how it was misinterpreted.
Well, Harry Turtledove did a story called The Griffin's Skull. It's in a historical series of historical novels he did, in which a academy-trained natural philosopher